Ava Mitchell had always been a dedicated student. From a young age, she dreamed of becoming a lawyer, determined to fight for justice in a world where fairness often seemed out of reach. Raised in a supportive middle-class black family, she understood the power of education and perseverance. When she was accepted into one of the nation's most prestigious law schools, it felt like all her hard work had finally paid off. However, from the very first day of Professor Richard Bennett's class, Ava sensed something was wrong. Bennett was a renowned constitutional law professor, highly respected, experienced, and known for his demanding coursework. But while he engaged openly with most students, he seemed to treat Ava differently. At first, it was subtle. Whenever she raised her hand in class, he would either ignore her or barely acknowledge her response before quickly moving on to another student. If a white student gave the same answer Ava had, he would nod approvingly or expand on their thoughts. It didn't take long for other students to notice the pattern, exchanging uneasy glances whenever it happened. One afternoon, after a particularly complex lecture on constitutional law, Ava stayed behind to ask a question. As she approached his desk, Professor Bennett barely looked up from his notes. "Yes," he asked, sounding impatient. "I wanted to clarify something about the 14th Amendment and how it applies to—" "I suggest you review the assigned readings more carefully," he interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "This class is very demanding, Miss Mitchell. You need to put in more effort to keep up." Ava's stomach tightened. She knew the material inside and out. She had spent hours studying every night. Yet, his tone made it seem as though she didn't belong in his class. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Ava noticed that Professor Bennett would often challenge her more aggressively than her peers. Whenever she made a strong argument in class, he would pick it apart relentlessly, sometimes even smirking as if to undermine her credibility. Meanwhile, other students who made similar arguments were met with approval. One particular day, after another frustrating lecture, Ava confided in her classmate, Emily, a white student who had become one of her closest friends. "I don't know what to do," Ava admitted, her voice low with frustration. "It feels like no matter how hard I try, he's always looking for a way to discredit me." Emily sighed. "Honestly, I've noticed it too. It's like he's always trying to catch you slipping, but he doesn't do that with anyone else." Ava hesitated. "Do you think it's because I'm—" Emily didn't let her finish. "Yes," she said firmly. "I do." Hearing it confirmed by someone else made Ava's chest tighten. She had worked her entire life to prove she belonged in spaces like this. But no matter how prepared she was, no matter how intelligent or hardworking, there were always people like Professor Bennett who would try to make her feel otherwise. That night, Ava sat in her dorm room, staring at her laptop screen. She had two options. She could stay quiet, endure the injustice, and hope it didn't affect her future. Or she could fight back, knowing that speaking out against a respected professor could come with serious consequences. She took a deep breath and opened a new document. If she was going to challenge this, she needed to gather evidence. And she needed to be ready. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had ever been told they didn't belong. Ava started paying closer attention in class, not just to the lessons, but to the way Professor Bennett interacted with students. She documented every instance where he dismissed her ideas, interrupted her, or praised a white student for a point she had already made. She also began secretly recording some of their interactions, ensuring she had solid proof if she needed it. Despite her best efforts to stay calm, each day in his class became harder. The stress was taking a toll on her. She had trouble sleeping, found herself second-guessing her intelligence, and even started to doubt whether she truly belonged in law school. Then, the moment that pushed her over the edge happened. During a class debate, Ava made a strong argument about a landmark civil rights case. Several students nodded in agreement, but Professor Bennett sneered. "That's a unique interpretation," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Though I suppose that perspective makes sense, given your background." The room fell silent. Ava's heart pounded. She clenched her jaw, refusing to let him see how much his words stung. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fire burning inside her. Professor Bennett shrugged. "Nothing. just that we all bring our personal experiences into our interpretations of the law. Some of us more than others. A few students gasped. Others looked down at their notes, unwilling to get involved. Ava knew then that she couldn't stay silent. That evening, she met with Emily and a few other classmates who had witnessed the incident. They agreed to sign statements detailing what they had seen and heard over the past semester. With their testimonies, her notes, and her recordings, she had enough evidence to take her complaint to the university administration. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Professor Bennett was a tenured professor, well respected in academic circles. But Ava also knew she wasn't alone. As she prepared her official complaint, she thought about all the other black students who had likely faced similar treatment but had been too afraid to speak up. She thought about the future students who would come after her. She refused to let fear silence her. It was time to fight. Ava sat in her dorm room, her laptop open, staring at the complaint form she had just filled out. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had done everything right, documented her experiences, gathered testimonies, and even recorded key moments. But a nagging doubt crept in. Would they actually listen to her? The university had a reputation for protecting tenured professors, especially those as respected as Bennett. If they brushed her off, she risked not only her grade in his class, but her entire academic standing. What if he retaliated? What if this backfired? She took a deep breath. No. She had come too far to let fear stop her. Ava pressed send. The complaint was officially submitted. The next morning, as she entered the lecture hall, something felt different. The usual hum of students chatting was quieter. People stole glances at her. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Then, she saw Emily rushing toward her. "He knows," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with urgency. Ava's stomach twisted. "How?" "I don't know, but I heard some students talking about it before class. Someone must have told him." Before Ava could respond, the lecture hall fell silent. Professor Bennett had entered. His eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly when they landed on her. Then he smirked. "Good morning, class," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "Today, we'll be discussing the complexities of judicial bias. A fitting topic, wouldn't you agree, Miss Mitchell?" Ava's pulse quickened. She forced herself to remain composed. "I'd say so, Professor." His smirk widened. "Excellent. Then perhaps you'd like to come up and demonstrate your understanding." Ava knew what this was. A test. A public humiliation attempt. Still, she wouldn't back down. She stood, walking confidently to the front of the class, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. Professor Bennett leaned back against his desk. Let's say a student files a formal complaint against their professor, claiming discrimination. What kind of legal precedent would support their case? Ava met his gaze head-on. "There are several precedents," she said, her voice steady. "For example, Alexander versus Yale, which established that educational institutions can be held accountable for discrimination under Title IX. Or Brown versus Board of Education, which—" "Ah," Bennett interrupted. "But are you sure you're interpreting those correctly? Legal analysis requires more than emotion, Miss Mitchell." A few students chuckled uncomfortably. Ava clenched her jaw. She refused to let him bait her. "With all due respect, Professor, legal analysis also requires considering the lived experiences of those affected by discrimination," she replied. "Which is why laws like Title VI exist, to protect students from exactly this kind of behavior." The room was silent. For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, uncertainty, crossed Bennett's face. Then he nodded. Interesting argument. Ava exhaled slowly as she returned to her seat. She had survived round one. But this fight was far from over. That evening, Ava met with Emily and a few other classmates who had witnessed Bennett's behavior firsthand. "We need to make sure the administration takes this seriously," she said, spreading out the statements they had collected. "I heard about a case last year," a student named Jason said. "A professor got investigated for misconduct, but nothing happened. He still teaches here." Ava's stomach sank. "So what do we do?" Emily asked. Ava thought for a moment. Then an idea formed. "We go public," she said. Emily's eyes widened. You mean social media? Exactly. Universities hate bad press. If we make enough noise, they'll have no choice but to act. It was risky. It could draw backlash. But it might also be their best shot at real change. Ava pulled out her phone and started typing. She was done staying silent. Ava Mitchell sat in the Student Affairs office, her hands gripping the stack of documents she had gathered over the past few weeks. Every instance of Professor Bennett's discrimination was meticulously recorded. Every time he dismissed her ideas, every time he interrupted her, every time he humiliated her in front of the class. Her heart pounded as she waited for her turn to speak. Across from her sat Dean Reynolds, a middle-aged black woman with a sharp gaze that had clearly seen many battles before. Next to her was Professor Howard, the head of the law department, who looked far less interested in the matter at hand. "So, Miss Mitchell," Dean Reynolds said, folding her hands, "you're here to file an official complaint against Professor Richard Bennett. Please, walk us through the details." Ava took a deep breath. This was it. She had spent weeks building up the courage for this moment. She laid out her case methodically, just as she had been trained to do. "Professor Bennett has consistently treated me differently from my peers. He refuses to acknowledge my contributions in class, dismisses my questions, and undermines my arguments, while praising white students for making the same points. I have documented multiple instances, and I have statements from classmates who have witnessed this behavior." She handed over the folder of statements. Dean Reynolds skimmed through the papers, her brow furrowing. Professor Howard, on the other hand, sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Ava," he said in a patronizing tone, "I understand that law school is competitive and stressful. It's natural to feel pressure, especially in a class as rigorous as Professor Bennett's. But you must understand that criticism is part of the learning process." Ava clenched her fists. She had expected resistance, but hearing the dismissal so casually thrown at her made her blood boil. "This isn't just criticism," she said firmly. "It's targeted discrimination. I'm not the only one who's noticed. My classmates." Professor Howard waved a hand. "Students are not always the best judges of these things. Bennett has been teaching for over 20 years. He's tough on everyone." "Really?" Ava challenged. "Because I have recordings that prove otherwise." Dean Reynolds lifted her eyes at that. Professor Howard straightened slightly. Ava pulled out her phone. "Here's one example from class last week. I made an argument about Brown versus Board of Education. He dismissed it outright. 5 minutes later, a white student made the exact same argument, and he called it brilliant insight." She pressed play. The voices filled the room, undeniable proof of Bennett's bias. Silence hung in the air when the recording ended. Dean Reynolds leaned back in her chair. "This is concerning," she said. Professor Howard, however, still seemed hesitant. "It's not ideal," he admitted. "But is this enough to claim outright discrimination? Perhaps he's just." Ava cut him off. "How much more proof do you need?" she asked, her voice rising with frustration. "If it were just one instance, I might question myself. But this has been happening all semester. If I stay silent, he'll keep doing this to other students after me." Dean Reynolds exchanged a glance with Professor Howard, who sighed in resignation. "We will need to conduct a formal investigation," Dean Reynolds finally said. "This means reviewing more recordings, speaking with other students, and confronting Professor Bennett." Ava nodded. She had prepared for this. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Dean Reynolds asked. Ava's stomach twisted, but she lifted her chin. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." A week later, news of Ava's complaint spread through the law school like wildfire. Some students supported her. Others whispered that she was overreacting, that she was trying to ruin a respected professor's career. One afternoon, as she walked through the hallway, she overheard 2 students talking. "This is ridiculous," one of them muttered. "Bennett is tough, but he's not racist." "She's just trying to get attention," another voice added. Ava kept walking, ignoring the sting of their words. Later that day, Emily caught up with her in the library. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern in her eyes. Ava exhaled. "I expected this," she admitted. "People don't like it when you challenge the system." "Just remember, you're not alone," Emily said. But it was hard to feel that way. The pressure was mounting. Ava could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation behind her back. And then, things took an even darker turn. An anonymous email arrived in her inbox. "Drop this. You're making a mistake." No name. No context. Just a warning. Ava's heart pounded. Was this a threat? A warning from someone who thought they were helping? Either way, she knew one thing. She couldn't back down now. The next day, she walked into Professor Bennett's class, expecting him to act as if nothing had changed. But when she sat down, she felt his eyes lingering on her. There was something different in his expression, not anger, but something colder. For the first time all semester, he called on her. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice smooth. "I assume you've come prepared with an argument today?" Ava met his gaze head on. "Always," she said. The class went silent. The tension was thick. And for the first time, Ava felt something shift. The battle was far from over, but she wasn't going anywhere. She was just getting started. Ava sat in the dimly lit library, her laptop glowing in front of her, as she scrolled through the evidence she had meticulously gathered over the past few weeks. The university's investigation had been slow-moving, but now, finally, she was being called to present her case in front of the disciplinary board. She wasn't naive. She knew how these things often played out. Universities protected their own. Tenured professors were rarely held accountable, and students who spoke up were often labeled as troublemakers. But she had come too far to stop now. Her phone buzzed. It was Emily. "Emily, you ready for tomorrow? I'll be there with you." Ava smiled slightly. At least she wasn't completely alone. The next morning, Ava dressed carefully. She chose a navy blue blazer, wanting to look as professional and composed as possible. As she walked toward the administration building, her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her head high. The hearing took place in a large, wood-paneled conference room. Dean Reynolds sat at the head of the table, flanked by a panel of faculty members. Across from Ava sat Professor Bennett, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "This is a formal disciplinary hearing regarding the complaint filed by Miss Ava Mitchell against Professor Richard Bennett," Dean Reynolds announced. "Miss Mitchell, you may present your case." Ava took a deep breath and began. She started by describing the first instances of bias, the dismissive comments, the ignored hand raises, the subtle but undeniable favoritism toward white students. Then she played the recordings. The room was silent as Bennett's voice filled the space. "I suggest you review the assigned readings more carefully, Miss Mitchell. This class is very demanding. You need to put in more effort to keep up." That's a unique interpretation. Though I suppose that perspective makes sense, given your background. Gasps rippled across the room. Ava noticed some professors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She wasn't just making accusations, she had proof. Emily had also submitted a statement, along with a few other students who had witnessed Bennett's behavior firsthand. Ava handed their testimonies to the panel. When she finished, she turned to Professor Bennett. "I have worked just as hard as anyone in this program. I will not allow you or anyone else to undermine my place here." Professor Bennett scoffed. "This is absurd," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "I challenge all my students. That's what law school is about, debate, critique. I do not single out anyone based on race." One of the faculty members, Professor Daniels, leaned forward. "Professor Bennett, how do you explain the pattern in these recordings? Miss Mitchell's statements are consistently dismissed, while other students making similar points are praised." Bennett's jaw tightened. "I hold all my students to the same standard." Ava could feel the tension in the room. She had done what she needed to do. Now it was up to them. After hours of deliberation, the panel finally reached a decision. Dean Reynolds cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Professor Bennett, the evidence presented here suggests a pattern of bias in your classroom. The university has decided that you will be placed on a 1-year probation, required to undergo diversity training, and your future classes will be monitored for fairness and inclusivity." Ava's breath caught. It wasn't the full punishment she had hoped for, but it was something. It was a public acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong. Bennett's face was tight with anger, but he said nothing. He stood, gathered his things, and left the room without another word. Emily squeezed Ava's hand. "You did it," she whispered. Ava exhaled slowly. She had done it. In the days that followed, the reaction on campus was mixed. Some professors treated her with newfound respect, others remained distant, as if she had betrayed some unspoken rule. Some classmates supported her, while others resented her for challenging a tenured professor. But something had changed. One afternoon, a younger black student approached her outside the library. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "You gave me the courage to stand up for myself." Ava smiled. That's what this was about. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be people like Bennett, and there would always be systems designed to protect them. But now, there would also be people like her. And that was just the beginning.